Good evening to our YouTube and Facebook viewers. You are watching the Courier Journal's coverage of election 2023. I'm Kirby Adams, along with Eleanor McCrary, also Phillip Bailey, and Joe Gerth, who is sporting a very fancy bow tie. We want to
that I tied it myself.
Tied
and
himself.
Did it on the first try. But,
Whoa.
I did want to forget to mention that. But we do have some important numbers that have come in tonight in the election, and we want to start right off with, of course, the governor's election.
And Governor Andy Beshear has won re-election here in Kentucky. Last I saw, he had about a 78,000 vote lead. With the votes remaining out there in Republican areas, it doesn't look like he's got much of an opportunity to pick up the votes that he needs to win.
Cameron,
And especially in Jefferson County, it looks like Beshear's going to come away with a 124,000 vote victory, which makes it very hard for anyone to win outside of that.
Look, I think that it's not just Andy Beshear winning, it's the way in which he won, right? I mean, there are a couple of things here. Those counties that Andy Beshear barely won against Matt Bevin in 2019, like Breathitt and Knott and Kenton County, he extended the lead there. In the Democratic strongholds like Lexington and Louisville, he is going to go through the roof. I mean, he won Louisville by around approximately 99,000 votes. And as Joe here said, we're thinking of between 120,000, maybe 124,000 vote margin. In Lexington, where he won by a sizable margin in 2019, he's increased that margin as well. The third thing, Daniel Cameron, in the districts and the counties that he is winning, he is not winning them to the same degree that Matt Bevin. He's underperforming Matt Bevin, who we all agreed was as popular as a sewer rat in this state. So those three things together, right, I think it's not just that he's winning, it's the way in which Andy Beshear is winning, and the fact that optimistic Democrats now nationally are saying, you had Robert Klein, the former White House chief of staff under Joe Biden, who's tweeted out, how did that Biden bashing work for you, Daniel?
And he just tweeted that out recently.
Just about 30 minutes
ago. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, now Democrats have something to spike the ball about here. Again, it's not just the fact that Andy Beshear won, it's the way that he's winning, I think, is the most surprising part of this.
Well, it looks like Beshear is actually going to win Hardin County, which is Cameron's home county. With 91% of the vote in, Beshear had a very narrow, but a lead in that race. So, I mean, Beshear is beating him where he needed to, and he's beating him some places where it wasn't necessarily expected.
And Kentucky Republicans are going to have to explain this, because every other, office that's running in this year's off-year election, they're winning. They've won Attorney General. They've won Secretary of State. Allison Ball has won for Treasurer. So they're going to clean up there just like they did 4 years ago. Yeah. But what the explanation is going to be is that if Daniel Cameron was more charismatic, if he was endorsed by Donald Trump, if he was the protege of Mitch McConnell, if everyone agrees he was more charismatic and more likable than Matt Bevin, why is he underperforming Matt Bevin in these key areas? And a thing that I think, you certainly see.
What you think.
Well, I think the one issue is going to come up is going to be the issue of race, right? I mean, there has to be some sort of explanation here about why a well-liked, more likable candidate, right, who had all of the underpinnings, had the establishment wing, had the endorsement from Donald Trump, why is he doing worse than Matt Bevin? And I think we know that answer in Louisville, right? He's going to get busted in Louisville. I think the Breonna Taylor folks are certainly going to be taking credit for. They're blowing up my phone, certainly taking credit for that additional margin. But there's going to have to be an explanation here out of the Republican Party here in Kentucky.
But obviously some of that is some of what's going on here is race related. I mean, I don't see how you can look at this and think that it's not. I mean, Beshear is winning in some counties in the eastern part of the state that you would have never expected him to win. But at the same time, I think you also have to look at the quality of the candidate. And Beshear is well liked. Yes. He's had 4 years to prove himself, and all the Republicans can complain about is some silly stuff about transgender kids that's going to affect 0.02% of the population.
Right.
All they can complain about is he took names and license plates outside of churches during a pandemic. These are not the type of issues that are going to move people, but there's not really too much you can hit Beshear on because he did perform well. That most people gave him high marks coming out of the pandemic, coming out of the tornadoes that hit the west, the floods that hit the east, and he was a tough candidate to beat.
And I also think that we can't discount the ad of the year
Yes.
and the abortion issue.
Yeah.
Last year, Kentuckians sent a pretty clear message what they thought about that abortion referendum that was on the ballot in 2022. And I think one thing that, Stephen Voss of University of Kentucky, a political science professor, talked to me for USA Today's story. And what he says is that oftentimes the legislature is guilty of running ahead of the rest of the population, running too far to the right. So on these issues of transgender kids, on these issues of abortion. So I think there's multiple things going on here at once. It's not really one thing. I think there's a racial element to it with Daniel Cameron. Beshear's popularity, him being well known in the state through his father for decades, and his work in being more empathetic and compassionate as a figure. But I also think that part of it is that the things that Daniel Cameron and Republicans were really leaning on, right, these issues of trans rights and abortion, were maybe too far to the right for the Kentucky populace as a whole.
Well, yeah, when you look at the issues, some of them really do matter, and they're showing up mattering in other parts of the country as well.
Right, and there's a reason Beshear kept that ad up for a full month, because it was working. And
You were talking about the young woman.
Who had been raped by her stepfather, and it was working. It was a powerful ad. I don't think I've ever seen an ad run for a full month like that.
Yeah, and I think the other part of it is, Kirby, is that, look, and Professor Voss spoke to this, Kentuckians are conservative people.
Okay.
Right? I think that's very, very clear by their culture, their trends, their traditions. But that cultural conservatism does not always equal a partisan vote. Right? And I think what was overestimated by the Republican Party in this situation was not just Beshear's likability, but how a lot of the issues post-Dobbs on abortion, they haven't really reconciled. That Emerson poll that showed this race tied, which we now see that was off, but that poll showed that among Republicans there's a divide over the abortion issue. They don't have a clear majority on where to go as far as these restrictions. There were about, I think, 37% who said they are in favor or opposed to the current trigger law here in Kentucky that doesn't have any exemptions for rape or incest. 41% of Republicans said they were okay with it. 21% of Republicans here in Kentucky said we're not sure yet. So Republicans in the post-Dobbs worlds are divided. The reason I know this is because former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley in New Hampshire, when USA Today did some presidential forums up there, she said, although I'm pro-life, we need to humanize this issue more. We need to stop demonizing people who are pro-choice. So the Republican Party itself is in flux and trying to figure out, and Daniel Cameron's answer probably wasn't sufficient for that.
You know what? I should know this answer, but I don't. What is the percentage of females to males in the state of Kentucky?
I think we are a majority woman state.
Yeah,
I think we are about 51%, maybe 52%. But even in that Emerson poll, 52% of Kentucky men thought that our trigger law goes too far.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's not like it was back in the day where this is a woman's issue only. There are men, Kentucky men, who are not the most liberal men in the world, right, in the country. They are saying that having a law that does not have exemptions for rape or incest goes too far. Even when you look at some of these other states like in Virginia or in Mississippi, they're not saying automatically no exemptions whatsoever. And I think that was something that Daniel Cameron was on his heels about. I think it's something that the Republican legislature was unable to adequately answer. And Andy Beshear, with his likability, with his aw shucks, whistling the Andy Griffin theme song out throughout the campaign, I think most people looked at him and said, that's the human being in this conversation. I may not like everything about the Democratic Party. I may not like everything about Joe Biden. But when compared in the contrast between the two, clearly Joe Biden's popularity in Kentucky isn't that great. Right? It's not doing well in swing states, so it's certainly not good here in Kentucky. But Kentuckians, I think, made a clear choice that we not only like this guy, but he represents our basic values. Maybe not our political partisanship, but our basic values better.
Okay, so, I don't know if we want to get into this or not, but will this be an indicator moving forward for national elections?
Well, I'm already getting texts from national Democrats who are saying to me, look, if Andy Beshear wins this race by 4,
By the way,
5,
I'd like your Rolodex. We don't call it Rolodexes anymore.
It's not a
but-
Rolodex anymore. Who, if he wins by 4, 5, 6 points or more, his name is absolutely going to be thrown into the mix as national office vice president. I think now that he's won, I think there's a couple of things that Kentuckians now need to think about here in his future. There's going to be a tremendous tug of war on Andy Beshear. I think the state party and others may want him to run for U.S. Senate in 2026, whether it's against Mitch McConnell for that empty seat, if Mitch McConnell decides not to run, which many think he won't. But there is going to be an immense amount of pressure, right, at the national level to say, someone like a Gretchen Whitmer, governor of Michigan, hey, you've run a trifecta Democratic state. Here's a Southern Democrat who has a great appeal, who doesn't have a whole lot of political dings against him from the left. He'd be a great vice presidential nominee for someone like a Gavin Newsom or Wes Moore of Maryland or Whitmer of Michigan. So Andy Beshear has a plethora of options. He's going to be tugged at in different ways. He, of course, is probably going to focus on the next 4 years. Damon Thayer, the state senator here, Republican, who can't stand Andy Beshear, has said he's going to do everything to make these next 4 years for Andy Beshear as difficult as possible. But nationally speaking, Beshear is going to have all sorts of political capital.
And the interesting thing about Thayer saying that is Thayer's home county went for Beshear. And so how much pressure will there be on him to work with Beshear?
There may not have been coattails in this race as far as the other candidates, but I do think that Andy Beshear is going to be able to go into the legislature in 2024, and be able to say, who's more popular here? Right? Like, you hit me with everything you got. I'm surrounded. Every other constitutional officer is a Republican. You have super duper majorities in both chambers of the legislature. Every congressional seat, besides the one here in Louisville, is Republican led. You threw everything you had at me. You threw Donald Trump at me. You threw every kitchen sink you had. And not only did I do well, but I did better than before.
All right, so let's put a pin in that for just a moment. We're going to come back to the rest of the state. But Eleanor, what's going on in Jefferson County, Metro Government, Metro Council, as well as do we know about the wet dry vote we talked about earlier?
Yeah, so to start with the wet dry vote, that's the closest one that we have going on as far as local stuff goes. Right now, 61% of people are voting in favor of making it dry. So I think it's a little over half of the votes have been counted.
And again, this is in what area?
It's in Clifton, around Clifton Heights. It's precinct in 163.
It's about 309 voters or something.
313. Four more people registered. So, yeah, it's pretty
They didn't
small.
work at Virtue Bar, did they? Those 4 people? Okay.
I did hear from the neighborhood association that the people who wanted the wet dry vote to be on this ballot were going around knocking on doors asking people to register to vote. So those 4 easily could have been people who want the precinct to become dry. And so right now...
But they may also be people who got out and voted who wouldn't normally have voted for governor and other offices. So, okay.
Yeah. So that one, I mean, the jury's still out on that one, but it's looking slightly more in favor of the precinct becoming dry, and it's unclear whether or not Virtue Bar will stay, just relocate, shut down. Not totally sure what's going to go on with that yet, if it does become dry.
And what about the special session in the Metro Council races?
Yeah, so early on, Gibran Crook, he conceded to Shamika Parrish-Wright for the District 3 seat. And so Parrish-Wright, she is the director of Vocal Kentucky, a grassroots organization in Louisville. She ran for mayor, and so he has conceded that seat. So it's looking like she will be the next District 3 councilwoman. Again, a little over half of votes being reported.
And things are a little contentious between her and the mayor?
Yes, she has publicly criticized the mayor in the past, and so I will expect...
She ran against the mayor, right?
She did run against the mayor. And I would expect that to continue with her on council. And so, I mean, Metro Council and the mayor work very closely together. She's also said that she wants to work with the administration, but she hasn't shied away from also being critical at times. So the last 2 races, District 6 and District 8, Phillip Baker has a very wide margin right now as far as winning goes. He is looking at about 88% of the vote in favor of him so far. He's the incumbent right now and was appointed earlier this year. Similar things are happening with District 8. So Ben Reno Weber, also the incumbent, he has 80% of the vote right now. So it's looking like those districts are going to keep their councilmen that they've had since they were appointed by the Democrats earlier this year. But again, just a little over 50% reporting.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll keep our eye on that. I know you will keep your eye on that. We'll see more about that in the Courier Journal tomorrow. What about, now let's take it out to Secretary of State. What do we see happen there?
I think Michael Adams, I mean, if there's any bipartisan, other than Andy Beshear perhaps, bipartisan candidate on this slate in 2023, I think you got to say it's Michael Adams, who stood up to, honestly, some small d democracy elements within his own party in the primary. All across this country, election deniers, individuals who denied that Joe Biden had won the 2020 election. I'm here to tell everyone, newsflash, Joe Biden did win the 2020 election. It's not even an issue. But in some states, Kirby, it is.
Yeah.
In some states, there are individuals who consistently maintain that former President Trump won that election, and particularly those who are running for Secretary of State. Michael Adams stood up against those forces in that primary, survived that primary, and I think he was rewarded for it in this general.
In fact, we had a couple of people running around the state. You had State Senator Southworth, and you had Steve Nipper, who was has been a candidate for Secretary of State before, going around the state having these events where they would put on presentations about how the race was stolen, and Adams could have sat by quietly and just let them do this craziness.
He refuted it every time.
Every time he stood up, and he deserves some credit for that, because there are a lot of people who wouldn't do that.
And I think if there's any coattails of this race, right, we're not seeing on the Democratic side. It doesn't look like any of the other Democrats are going to win a statewide election here. But Michael Adams had an ad, and it didn't feature Donald Trump, it didn't feature Daniel Cameron, it didn't feature Mitch McConnell or any other Republican. It featured Andy Beshear. And besides standing up to those election-denying forces within his own party, the other thing that distinguished, I think, Michael Adams was that he, during the pandemic, worked with Andy Beshear. And the reason why Kentuckians have 3 days of early voting, right? Those of us who've been in this state all our lives, something like early voting was a fantasy. And he made that, along with Governor Beshear, a reality. And I think those two things made a lot of moderate, liberal, even Democratic voters go and look at Michael Adams and say, I'll give him a shot. I don't see him in the same way that I see maybe the direction of the party as a whole. He may end up being, I don't know, maybe Joe, the highest vote getter in 2023, but certainly Michael Adams stood up to his own party and survived an ugly primary. I don't know what his political future will be after this.
Yeah, I don't think he has too much of one, but
he will certainly be, I think he'll be certainly thought of as someone who is a hero of small d democracy.
Yeah. Well, good for Michael Adams then. What about, let's move on to Attorney General race.
Went like we kind of expected it to go.
Yeah.
I mean, Russell Coleman looks like an attorney. I mean, he looks like an FBI agent. If you were going to cast someone to be in a movie, like one of those old Harrison Ford movies,
yes.
Like, get off my plane. Yeah. Like, he looks like he could play a GI man. I don't think anyone's surprised by Russell Coleman's victory here, or any other Republican. I think now we're going to see, the question I have is, how much is Russell Coleman going to take on Andy Beshear in these last 4 years? Is he going to have a more hands-off approach? Is he going to look maybe to see like, or is he going to do what attorney generals both on the Democratic and Republican side have done to governors from the opposing party, be this sort of vexing force that sort of bothers them throughout? I think you are going to see Russell's a conservative, but during this election, right, during this general election, Russell was asked about the same abortion issue, and he said in an interview with Mario Anderson of Spectrum News, he said, I don't want to criminalize women who've already been victimized via sexual assault. Right, so even Russell's view on that began to soften more so than even Daniel Cameron's. Yeah. So I'm very interested to see how Russell will approach this in the next few months.
That is interesting.
And in addition to Russell having some attributes that kind of played well into this race, his opponent had some attributes that didn't. And one of those was, when she started this race, she had not even passed the bar in Kentucky. Now, and this was because she had spent a career in the military, working as a JAG officer. She didn't need to be to have a law license in Kentucky, but Coleman made a big deal out of that, and I think it obviously had some impact.
That's one of those things, Kirby, when you, for an average person, not people like us who are plugged in and covering this stuff day to day, who can explain some of the nuances of it. You're an average person walking down the street, and someone tells you, "Oh, Attorney General's race is coming up. Who you gonna vote for?" "Oh, I'm thinking about this person, that person." But the one person, they even have a law license in Kentucky? Like that becomes an like. It was such a fumble, and again, Representative Stevenson has a stellar career. Her resume is untouchable.
Yeah.
It should not be touched at all. Her qualifications and her service to this country internationally. So when you hear something like that you don't even have a law license in the country, excuse me, in the state that you want to be Attorney General in, it's an automatic for average people. It's an automatic turnoff.
Interesting. All right. Well, I guess that is just about all the different races that we're going to go over at this point. I want to go back to one thing, though, that you said in our last cut-in, and I think it's so important, and you touched on it again, but just the fact that Andy Beshear now has this, I mean, he's had this name recognition and this brand, basically. I don't want to confuse brand with Biden, but his the Beshear brand in the state has become very important. And this is very likely going to elevate him to a whole different level.
I would warn national Democrats not to get too excited, though.
Okay.
I mean, they're having a good night. It looks like in Virginia, things are, the Ohio referendum on marijuana and abortion, seems like they're spiking the ball on that. Obviously, Kentucky. I think Mississippi is still going to remain in the Republican column. Again, Tate Reeves, very unpopular, showing you again how hard it is to beat an incumbent governor. It just is. In fact, the last 2 cycles, the only Republican incumbent governor who lost happened to be Matt Bevin here in Kentucky. But I would caution national Democrats. Andy Beshear has a unique situation here. His father, his relationship with Kentuckians via COVID and the tornadoes and the floods. I don't think necessarily Joe Biden can look at that and go, aha, although Kentucky has been that bellwether for the presidential race for the past 20 years. I do think there's a couple of things. If Andy Beshear does become a national political figure, if his name does get tossed around for vice president, one thing he hasn't had to tussle with that he will at that level is the activist left. He has not had progressive forces against him really that much in the state. He has either hired them for jobs or they've just been so politically unimportant they haven't really been an issue here in Kentucky at all. I think that's going to be an issue.
Or his opponent has been so disliked by the activist wing of the Democratic Party that they didn't care about going after him.
Right. I mean, Andy Beshear sent in the National Guard into Louisville during the protests during the Breonna Taylor case. That National Guard activity resulted in the death of David McAtee, a barbecue chef in the West End. And there were hordes of people at that corner of 26th and Broadway, ready for some sort of confrontation with the police that had to be quelled by ministers. Former Representative Charles Booker certainly has to be commended for trying to quell the anger on that particular day. That was an angry moment. Where was Andy Beshear's field office in the West End? 26th and Broadway, right across the street from where David McAtee was killed. You haven't heard David McAtee's name one time in this campaign. Not from the activist left, not from mainstream Democrats, no one.
You're right.
But if Andy Beshear is going to go to the national stage, I guarantee you Black Lives Matter groups and other activist groups, they'll remember David McAtee's name. Ask Amy Klobuchar, the senator from Minnesota, about her past record on issues of race and how that gets brought back up, drudged back up years later. So if there's anything that, if Andy Beshear does go to the national stage, he will have to contend with the activist left, issues of police brutality, issues of international issues like what's going on in Israel and Gaza. So that's the only issue that I think he might face. But for right now, Andy Beshear is probably the star of the Biden White House, the star of the Democratic Party.
Do you feel like it's fair to look at what's happening as far as the issues are concerned and how people have voted across the nation in these elections on the issues? And I'm talking about issues of like reproduction rights and that kind of thing. As moving forward, as on a national level, do you think that will change that conversation at all as we go into a presidential campaign?
I don't think abortion is a conservative issue anymore. It's a liberal issue now. With Ohio now, we've had 7 states since the Dobbs decision by the Supreme Court that have taken on abortion at the referendum level, not the legislatures, right? Not the professional politicians and the lobbyists and the activists, regular voters in Montana, California, Kansas, Kentucky, Ohio, 7 states now, the pro-choice side has won, right? And Republicans are really going to have to reconfigure this. They're going to have to really rethink the pro-life movement and how it's going to work post-Dobbs.
And I think you throw in there the Andy Beshear win, because you can't discount the effect that the abortion issues had on Beshear's ability to win this race.
I was talking to Adam Edlin, who ran, former Kentucky auditor, who ran to the left of Andy Beshear in that primary back in 2019 on the Democratic side. And he said, look, I don't even remember Andy Beshear having a position on abortion when I ran against him, right, in 2019. And Edlin feels as if, look, this has changed, radically changed Southern politics. I mean, these, not just these referendums, Kirby, but some of these states are tracking women, right? Tracking them, right? Like, let's think about that. Like asking women like about their, not just their health care, but like asking them the follow-up issue of like, where is your health care? And having random neighbors go after people. We've had stories about.
Right. I see what you're talking about, yeah.
We've had stories about 10-year-olds in Ohio and places that have been sexually assaulted, basically saying, well, and it's like, no, that's not what the Dobbs case was even about. It was at least 15 weeks with exemptions. So that, I think, has radically changed how we think about abortion. This is not a Roe world anymore. It isn't. It's a post-Dobbs world. And in this world, I think Democrats and pro-choice folks are leaning to that issue in ways you've never seen before.
All right.
And we've also got more Democrats wrapping their arms around Andy Beshear. Apparently this evening, the president called Beshear and congratulated him on his victory. So
I do wonder if Joe Biden will be mentioned more by Andy Beshear in that second term, now that he's been vindicated to a certain degree.
I think that
We'll
all
have to wait
depends
and
on if
see.
he wants to run for the U.S. Senate.
Whether he runs for U.S. Senate, exactly. That's the next question. But let's let the governor enjoy his reelection now. We always like to jump into the next election before this election's even over.
Yeah, but I'm already imagining Jack Harlow performing at the White House. I just have to say.
Yes,
So,
I can see that.
I
And
really-
Taylor Swift, with Taylor Swift.
With Taylor Swift. Well, yeah. How about Beyonce, too?
Why not? Throw them all in there. Throw them all in there. Just don't invite Kanye.
All right. Well, I appreciate all your insights.
Thank you.
Truly, they're wonderful, and we appreciate all your expertise in this. Thank you for watching, and we'll have more in the Courier Journal tomorrow morning. Thanks again, and gosh, we'll see you within a year.